Expensive house prices are destroying everything about Australia. The economy, social cohesion, and the financial future of millions of Australians. And yet, there is absolutely no real action being taken to address this housing ponzi. Shockingly, we now have a two-class system between the property haves and the have-nots, where if your family owns property, you can thrive financially, but if they don't, you're kicked to the economic curb. House price rises in Australia are completely unsustainable. But will we take action now, or just kick the can down the road and completely destroy the country? I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. What's Beethoven doing in his grave? Decomposing. And what's brown and sits on a piano stool? Beethoven's last movement. That's just some classic musical jokes for you. But if you'd like to make beautiful music together, why don't you like this video and subscribe to my channel? Our symphonies will be angelic. But also, I'll keep you up to date on the housing market and the economy by providing my independent analysis and commentary. Today, I'm going to be reacting to this video from Friendly Geordies titled Migration, Housing and the Economy. The video is quite long, so I'll specifically focus on the content around housing. Let's check it out.
Our apathy to this downward slide paradoxically might be a rare nation-defining characteristic. Our social cohesion is apparently at record lows.
Yes, it's quite perplexing how apathetic Australians are to the real destruction in living conditions that's going on right now. Considering Australia has some of the worst housing affordability in the entire world, millions of Australians have just copped it on the chin. But there are some signs that Australians might finally be starting to rise up.
When you compare us to other Western capitalist liberal democracies, land value in Australia is ridiculously overinflated to the point that it detriments every other industry.
Yep. Ultra high house prices in a country like Australia is absolutely disgraceful. It makes it harder to be successful in business because rents are so high. It makes it extremely difficult to produce anything in Australia because wages now have to be high just for people to be able to afford to pay for their housing. And producers can't afford to pay high wages, so they go elsewhere. And then you have the inequality that ultra high house prices bring, where those who were fortunate enough to be able to buy housing when it was ultra cheap now profit massively for all the newcomers trying to enter the market at these ultra inflated prices. So those at the top of the housing ponzi didn't work harder to get there. They didn't study harder. They don't have any more skills. They were just alive at the right time to buy cheaply and ride the wave of inflated house prices. A recent survey shows that nearly half of all boomers could not afford their current home if they were to buy them today. How about that for a kick in the nutsack for those trying to buy their first home? You're 25 years too late.
We've got over it so many times, but Howard halved the capital gains tax. That might be the biggest sin in modern Australian political history. He removed all limitations on negative gearing and doubled migration, greatly incentivising the speculation of land and thus the borrowing of more money from big banks.
Yep. That's when the start of this speculative housing nightmare began. By creating policies that encourage speculative demand into housing, you end up with a country that's obsessed with making easy, tax-effective gains from property. And you get to the inevitable point where we are now, where you make more from property prices rising than a full-time worker makes at their job over an entire year. Another kick in the nuts for young people. You might be working doing the same job as someone else, but if they have property, they could easily be growing their wealth by double that you're able to, and it's probably more like triple due to tax concessions for property owners.
The effect of these policies might have been the mirage of some Australians thinking they're richer as they bought a house for 20 grand and a slab of VB, and that house is now worth $2 million.
Well, it's not a mirage because they are richer, especially when you compare them to non-property owners. I mean, just since COVID, house prices have risen more than 50% in places like Brisbane and Adelaide. Now, if you weren't fortunate enough to own a property during that period, property owners have gained hundreds of thousands of personal wealth that you've missed out on. And if it's their own home, it's completely tax-free. And if it's an investment property, they can claim negative gearing and only pay 50% capital gains tax when they go to sell. That's why Australia's turned into a two-speed economy, where property owners are seeing their wealth supercharged, while non-property owners are going backwards financially.
So much capital is now tied up in land and debt to foreign banks that there is a lot of money that gets deployed to lobby against any changes to Australia's current system. We saw that in the 2019 election with the scare campaign the Liberals launched against Labor's proposed negative gearing changes, coupled with the fact that any deep fix for these issues probably requires deflating the property market.
This is dead right. The housing market has made so much money for so many people. Everyone who's benefiting will fight tooth and nail to make sure it continues. And this is really sad because they're denying millions of Australians the same opportunities that they had. In the entire history of Australia, up until 25 years ago, housing was extremely affordable. Do we want to live in a country where study and hard work no longer has anything to do with financial success, where the only thing that matters is if you inherit property or not? That's the sort of country where you have rulers and slaves, or lords and peasants. That's not the sort of country I want to live in. I mean, we abolished slavery, but now we're bringing it back by making millions of Australians financial slaves.
But the fact is, we're not in 2019 anymore. The situation is far more precarious. I'm really reminded of this Lee Kuan Yew quote. I resolved to enable every household to own its own home. If we were going to get people to take the national service seriously, I could not ask their sons to fight and die for the properties of the wealthy.
What an amazing quote. By providing affordable housing, citizens can buy their own home and feel like they own a part of that country. But if you inflate house prices so high that millions are now locked out of the property market, they'll feel completely abandoned and isolated from their own country. And that's when we'll see social upheaval take over.
Who in their right mind would fight a war to defend the right to pay landlords rent? Oh, and foreign banks' interest. It's getting out of hand. How much capital are we going to pour into housing before we think, okay, nah, we've done it. We've brought back serfdom?
As much capital as they can possibly squeeze out of property buyers. I mean, politicians have massive property portfolios and they want to retire in luxury, don't they?
I think eventually public and political appetite for Labor to make larger changes like the ones that they proposed in 2019 will eventually come.
I don't think it matters who's in power, as the number of Australians who don't own property continues to increase. Their political voting power will also increase. And with the high cost of housing being the most significant financial impact of their lives, I'm certain that housing policies will be the major political battlegrounds. So real reform is inevitable in my opinion. It's just a matter of when.
Australia is heading in an unsustainable direction, and the business community can harp on and on about how they want to boost housing supply.
Why has the mantra for a number of years now been all about boosting housing supply? I think it's because they really want house prices to continue rising, but they want to look like they're concerned about trying to improve housing affordability.
If you really want to blame Labor for the cost of living, don't go after them for raising the pay of workers. Go after them for their weak migration policy. Well, the Libs do that, but that is the pot calling the kettle black. As I've pointed out too many times, Howard is the man that radically changed migration policy in this country. He doubled the permanent intake.
Yes, the Libs increased immigration levels, but they never lost all control of immigration levels during the middle of the worst housing crisis in Australia's history. I mean, just back in 2021, when Albanese was in opposition, he wouldn't support plans to take on 160,000 new migrants each year, saying the government should be focused on training Australians in areas where there's skill shortages. I mean, that was 160k, and now we're running levels of 600,000 migrants per year, creating so much demand for housing that full-time workers are finding themselves homeless and having to live in their car or in a tent.
Take this article from the Australia Institute. Australia is like not being flooded by migrants. Yes, we are, you preachy dickheads. And to admit that doesn't mean you're a racist or a reactionary that hates migrants. It doesn't make you just really mean, like just a really mean dude.
It's funny, but it's true. People who carry on that immigration has nothing to do with the housing market are completely insane in my opinion. If you have more people competing to either buy a home or to rent a home, it's gonna have an impact.
I'm sorry, is this an Australia Institute article or a Business Council press release? Because what happened during COVID when there was record low migration? Oh, people could pay their rent. And real wages were much stronger. And this was in no small part because of the near total shutdown of migration.
The basic laws of supply and demand never fail. In countries like China and Japan, where they have an oversupply of housing, property prices rise far slower, or they even start to decline, as buyers and renters have a lot more choice and a lot more bargaining power. But when there's limited stock, and you have multiple buyers and multiple renters, you end up in a bloody crisis. And what do you know? That's what we got. And what would be the quickest and simplest solution? Significantly reducing migration levels. Australians know it, the government knows it, so the question needs to be asked, why aren't they doing it?
It's not the only reason, but it was a fucking big one. But no one seems to want to point this out because they're either compromised by business interests or scared of looking like Donald Trump. This is despite massive public support for reeling in migration. Poll after poll shows that Australians think we're letting in too many people.
This is what's so crazy about the current housing crisis. Australians in general want much lower migration levels, yet they're being completely ignored by the government who's meant to serve the people.
So why can't people in power act in their interests? It'd be less of a risk than Labor's backflip on tax cuts, which they easily won Australians over with. But serious reform is needed, and if it doesn't happen, this issue will seriously dog you in the future.
This is one thing I really don't understand. If, for example, the Liberal Party came out with a policy saying they're going to slash migration levels to ease the housing crisis, it would probably end up being an election-winning policy. But they're not doing it, and I've got no idea why. Well, I do have some thoughts about it.
Listen to Party Elder Bob Carr on this one.
The advantages of high levels of immigration are assumed. They're never explained. The disadvantage of running immigration at these super high levels, the highest levels in the developed world, are very clear.
Dead right. We're told that we need to bring in migrants to build more houses. But Australia already has the highest level of people working in construction per capita. So why do we need mass immigration levels? Is it to put lipstick on a pig? Make the economy look better than it actually is? Because our entire economy seems to be based on property, mining, and overseas students.
But above all, the increased cost of housing. The price of housing reflects the laws of supply and demand. And if you pump more people in, if you pump up immigration to the highest ever level we've seen, then the pressure on housing is huge. And everyone understands that.
Everyone does understand that.
Young people struggling with home purchase and renters being hugely disadvantaged will easily nominate that they stand for a reduction in immigration to take pressure off this overheated home and rental market.
Makes bloody sense.
Not even the Greens, who are comfortable floating the most radical and sometimes outlandish of policies to deal with the housing crisis, have the guts to suggest a drop in migration. It's truly an issue that the political class won't touch.
I mean, the Greens' major policy is trying to fix housing affordability. Yet why would they ignore immigration when it unequivocally has a direct impact on housing affordability?
You can like migrants and still think migration needs to be reined in. I think migrants play an important role in Australian society, but there is a lot of forces in this country that offer false solutions to the cost of living crisis while benefiting from the very policies that exacerbate it.
Well, there you have it. Australian house price growth is unsustainable and we're ultimately headed for social destruction. We need reform immediately, but all major parties in Australia are completely ignoring one of the main factors that's driving ridiculous demand for housing and thus worsening this housing crisis. Are we going to see this housing ponzi protected at all costs, or will we see major disruptive change? I'm Biko Konstantinos.